Washington tried to deter Japanese entry into the war by threatening the firebombing of Japanese cities using B-17 strategic bombers based in the Philippines. The U.S. sent too little too late, as the Japanese easily overwhelmed the American Far Eastern Air Force the day after Pearl Harbor, 66. Japanese naval air power proved unexpectedly powerful, sinking the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, then raging widely across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to defeat elements of the British, American, Dutch, and Australian forces. Land-based air power, coordinated efficiently with land forces, enabled Japan to overrun Malaya, Singapore, 67, and the Philippines by spring 1942, 68. The Doolittle raid used 16 B-25 bombers, taking off from aircraft carrier 69, to bomb Tokyo in April 1942. Little physical damage was done, but the episode shocked and stunned the Japanese people and leadership. 70. 1942. Japanese warplanes bombing the Dutch light cruiser HNLMS Java during the Battle of Java Sea. At the Battle of the Java Sea, February 27, 1942, the Japanese Navy destroyed the main ABDA, American, British, Dutch, and Australian naval force. The Netherlands East Indies campaign resulted in the surrender of Allied forces on Java. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft had all but eliminated Allied air power in Southeast Asia and began attacking Australia, with a major raid on Darwin, February 19. A raid by a powerful Japanese Navy aircraft carrier force into the Indian Ocean resulted in the Battle of Ceylon and sinking of a British carrier, HMS Hermes, as well as 2 cruisers and other ships, effectively driving the British fleet out of the Indian Ocean and paving the way for Japanese conquest of Burma and a drive towards India. 71. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. However, the Doolittle raid caused an uproar in the Japanese Army and Navy commands. They had both lost face in letting the emperor be threatened. As a consequence, the Army relocated overseas fighter groups to Japan, groups needed elsewhere. Even more significantly, the Naval Command believed it had to extend its eastern defense perimeter, and they focused on Midway as the next base. Coral Sea and Midway. By mid-1942, the Japanese combined fleet found itself holding a vast area, even though it lacked the aircraft carriers, aircraft, and aircrew to defend it, and the freighters, tankers, and destroyers necessary to sustain it. Moreover, fleet doctrine was incompetent to execute the proposed barrier, defense. 72 instead, they decided on additional attacks in both the South and Central Pacific. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought between May 4-8, 1942 off the coast of Australia, the opposing fleets never saw one another. It was an air exchange. While the Americans had greater losses and arguably a tactical loss, having lost a fleet carrier while sinking a Japanese light carrier, they gained a strategic victory, as Japan canceled a planned offensive. 73. Most critically, the damage to one of the Japanese fleet carriers and the other carrier's air group would leave both carriers out of the Battle of Midway, preventing them from bringing their 144 aircraft, at full strength, to supplement the Japanese carrier force. This would allow the American forces to be at near parity temporarily, setting the stage for the turning point of the Pacific War. In the Battle of Midway, the Japanese split a portion of their fleet toward the Aleutians in a simultaneous operation, as well as separating the majority of its surface force from the Japanese carriers. The Americans, on the other hand, had received critical details of the Midway operation due to a cryptographic breakthrough, which included dates and a complete order of battle. As such, American forces were able to ambush the Japanese carriers. On the other hand, the Japanese expected American carriers to sail from Pearl Harbor after Midway had been attacked. The unexpected presence of American carriers would lead to the early tactical mistakes the Japanese commander would make. Japan had 272 warplanes operating from 4 carriers. The U.S. Navy carriers had 233 aircraft, but there were also another 115 AAF and Marine land-based aircraft on Midway itself. Due to tactical errors by the Japanese commander and the lucky breaks in executing the decisive American attack, in addition to the skill of the American aviators and commanders, the Japanese lost 3 of their 4 carriers early in the battle. The decisive attack was 2 simultaneous, unplanned dive bomber attacks arriving after approximately 90 minutes of constant harassment from various American land and naval air squadrons. This harassment had left the Japanese combat air patrol out of position, especially as the combat air patrol was focused on an ongoing torpedo bomber attack. The harassment had also prevented the Japanese carriers from launching a strike on the American carriers, and the 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, having only made one ineffective attack against Midway itself. The final 4th carrier would be sunk by the end of the day. The 4th carrier, however, managed to cripple one American carrier, which would later be sunk by a submarine. Having lost all their carriers, the Japanese were forced to retreat, unable to use the rest of their surface fleet, including the battleships, without air cover. Having lost all but 2 of their fleet carriers, the ones damaged at Coral Sea, the Japanese never again launched a major, effective offensive in the Pacific. The successes of the Japanese naval air arm, having won stunning victories for the Japanese Navy in the first half of 1942, came to a sharp stop after the Battle of Midway, 74-75. Guadalcanal. Main article: Guadalcanal Campaign. The Japanese had built a major air base on the island of Rabaul, but had difficulty keeping it supplied. American naval and marine aviation made Rabaul a frequent bombing target. Cactus Air Force warplanes on Henderson Field, Guadalcanal in October 1942. A Japanese airfield was spotted under construction at Guadalcanal. The Americans made an amphibious landing in August 1942 to seize it, sent in the Cactus Air Force, and started to reverse the tide of Japanese conquests. As a result, Japanese and Allied forces both occupied various parts of Guadalcanal. Over the following 6 months, both sides fed resources into an escalating battle of attrition on the island, at sea, and in the sky, with eventual victory going to the Americans in February 1943. It was a campaign the Japanese could ill afford. A majority of Japanese aircraft from the entire South Pacific area was drained into the Japanese defense of Guadalcanal. Japanese logistics, as happened time and again, failed. Only 20% of the supplies dispatched from Rabaul to Guadalcanal ever reached there. 76. 1940 through 1945. After 1942, the United States made a massive effort to build up its aviation forces in the Pacific and began island hopping to push its airfields closer and closer to Tokyo. Meanwhile, the Japanese were unable to upgrade their aircraft, and they fell further and further behind in numbers of aircraft carriers. The forward island bases were very hard to supply. Often only submarines could get through, and the Japanese forces worked without replacements or rest, and often with inadequate food and medicine. Their morale and performance steadily declined. Starvation became an issue in many bases. 77. The American airmen were well fed and well supplied, but they were not rotated and faced increasingly severe stress that caused their performance to deteriorate. They flew far more often in the Southwest Pacific than in Europe, and although rest time in Australia was scheduled, there was no fixed number of missions that would produce transfer back to the States. Coupled with the monotonous, hot, disease-ridden environment, the result was bad morale that jaded veterans quickly passed along to newcomers. 78. After a few months, epidemics of combat fatigue would drastically reduce the efficiency of units. The men who had been at jungle airfields longest, the flight surgeons reported, were in the worst shape. Many have chronic dysentery or other disease, and almost all show chronic fatigue states. They appear listless, Unkempt, careless, and apathetic with almost mask-like facial expression. Speech is slow, thought content is poor. They complain of chronic headaches, insomnia, memory defect, feel forgotten, worry about themselves, are afraid of new assignments, have no sense of responsibility, and are hopeless about the future. 79. Strategic bombing of Japan. Main article: Air raids on Japan. The flammability of Japan's large cities and the concentration of munitions production there made strategic bombing the preferred strategy of the Americans. The first efforts were made from bases in China. Massive efforts costing $4.5 billion to establish B-29 bases there had failed when in 1944 the Japanese army simply moved overland and captured them. The Marianas, especially the islands of Saipan and Tinian, captured in June 1944, gave a close, secure base for the very long-range B-29. The superfortress. The B-29 represented the highest achievement of traditional pre-jet aeronautics. Its four 2,200 horsepower Wright R3350 supercharged engines could lift 4 tons of bombs 3,500 miles at 33,000 feet, high above Japanese flak or fighters. Computerized fire control mechanisms made its 13 guns exceptionally lethal against fighters. However, the systematic raids that began in June 1944 were unsatisfactory because the AAF had learned too much in Europe. It overemphasized self-defense. Arnold, in personal charge of the campaign, bypassing the theater commanders, brought in a new leader, General Curtis LeMay. In early 1945, LeMay ordered a radical change in tactics: remove the machine guns and gunners, fly in low at night. Much fuel was used to get to 30,000 feet. It could now be replaced with more bombs. The Japanese radar, fighter, and anti-aircraft systems were so ineffective that they could not hit the bombers. Fires raged through the cities, and millions of civilians fled to the mountains. Tokyo was hit repeatedly, and first suffered a serious blow with the Operation Meeting House Raid 80. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, a conflagration that destroyed nearly 270,000 buildings over a 16-square-mile, 41 km2 area, killing at least 83,000, and estimated by some to be the single most destructive bombing raid in military history. On June 5, 51,000 buildings in 4 miles of Kobe were burned out by 473 B-29s. Japanese opposition was fierce, as 11 B-29s went down and 176 were damaged. Osaka, where 1/6 of the empire's munitions were made, was hit by 1,733 tons of incendiaries dropped by 247 B-29s. A firestorm burned out 8.1 square miles, including 135,000 houses. 4,000 died. 8182, the Japanese local officials reported. Although damage to big factories was slight, approximately 1/4 of some 4,000 lesser factories, which operated hand-in-hand with the big factories, were completely destroyed by fire. Moreover, owing to the rising fear of air attacks, workers in general were reluctant to work in the factories, and the attendance fluctuated as much as 50%. The Japanese army, which was not based in the cities, was largely undamaged by the raids. The army was short of food and gasoline, but, as Iwo Jima and Okinawa proved, it was capable of ferocious resistance. The Japanese also had a new tactic that it hoped would provide the bargaining power to get a satisfactory peace: the kamikaze. Kamikaze. Main article: Kamikaze. In late 1944, the Japanese invented an unexpected and highly effective new tactic: the kamikaze suicide plane aimed like a guided missile at American ships. Kamikaze means divine wind, a reference to the hurricane that sunk an invading Mongol force in 1274. The attacks began in October 1944 and continued to the end of the war. Most of the aircraft used in kamikaze attacks were converted obsolete fighters and dive bombers. The quality of construction was very poor, and many crashed during training or before reaching targets. Experienced pilots were used to lead a mission because they could navigate. They were not kamikazes, and they returned to base for another mission. The kamikaze pilots were inexperienced and had minimal training. However, most were well-educated and intensely committed to the Emperor. 8384. A stricken Yokosuka D-4Y in a suicide dive against USS Essex in 1944. Kamikaze attacks were highly effective at the Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945. During the three-month battle, 4,000 kamikaze sorties sank 38 U.S. ships and damaged 368 more, killing 4,900 sailors in the American Fifth Fleet. Destroyers and destroyer escorts doing radar picket duty were hit hard. As the inexperienced pilots dived at the first American ship, they spotted instead of waiting to get at the big carriers. 85 Task Force 58 analyzed the Japanese technique at Okinawa in April 1945. Rarely have the enemy attacks been so cleverly executed and made with such reckless determination. These attacks were generally by single or few aircraft making their approaches with radical changes in course and altitude, dispersing when intercepted and using cloud cover to every advantage. They tailed our friendlies home, used decoy planes, and came in at any altitude or on the water. The Americans decided their best defense against kamikazes was to knock them out on the ground, or else in the air long before they approached the fleet. The Navy called for more fighters and more warning. The carriers replaced a fourth of their light bombers with Marine fighters. Back home, the training of fighter pilots was stepped up. More combat air patrols circling the big ships, more radar picket ships, which themselves became prime targets, and more attacks on air bases and gasoline supplies eventually worked. Japan suspended kamikaze attacks in May 1945 because it was now hoarding gasoline and hiding planes in preparation for new suicide attacks in case the Allied forces tried to invade their home islands. Citation needed. The kamikaze strategy allowed the use of untrained pilots and obsolete planes, and since evasive maneuvering was dropped and there was no return trip, the scarce gasoline reserves could be stretched further. Since pilots guided their airplane like a guided missile all the way to the target, the proportion of hits was much higher than in ordinary bombing, and would eventually see the introduction of a purpose-built, air-launched rocket-powered suicide aircraft design in small numbers to accomplish such missions against U.S. Navy ships. Japan's industry was manufacturing 1,500 new planes a month in 1945. Citation needed. Toward the end of the war, the Japanese press encouraged civilians to emulate the kamikaze pilots who willingly gave their lives to stop American naval forces. Civilians were told that the reward for such behavior was enshrinement as a warrior god and spiritual protection in the afterlife. 87. Expecting increased resistance, including far more kamikaze attacks once the main islands of Japan were invaded, the U.S. High Command rethought its strategy and used atomic bombs to end the war. Hopping it would make a costly invasion unnecessary. 88. Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Main article: Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The air attacks on Japan had crippled her ability to wage war, but the Japanese had not surrendered. On July 26, 1945, United States President Harry S. Truman, United Kingdom Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chairman of the Chinese Nationalist Government Chiang Kai-shek issued the Potsdam Declaration, which outlined the terms of surrender for the Empire of Japan as agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference. This ultimatum stated if Japan did not surrender, she would face prompt and utter destruction. 89. The Japanese government ignored this ultimatum, mokusatsu, kill by silence, and vowed to continue resisting an anticipated Allied invasion of Japan. On August 6, 1945, the little boy enriched uranium atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, followed on August 9 by the detonation of the Fat Man, plutonium core atomic bomb over Nagasaki. Both cities were destroyed with enormous loss of life and psychological shock. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan, stating, "Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers." Europe, 1939–1941. The Luftwaffe gained significant combat experience in the Spanish Civil War, where it was used to provide close air support for infantry units. The success of the Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers in the blitzkriegs that shattered Poland in 1939 and France in 1940 gave Berlin inordinate confidence in its air force. Military professionals could not ignore the effectiveness of the Stuka, but also observed that France and Poland had minimal effective air defense. Outside Britain, the idea of an integrated air defense system had not emerged. Most militaries had a conflict between the advocates of anti-aircraft artillery and fighter aircraft for defense, not recognizing that they could be complementary when under a common system of command and control. A system that had a common operational picture of the battle in progress. Invasion of Poland. Main article: Invasion of Poland. Ju-87 diving procedure. Luftwaffe aircraft closely supported the advance of the Army mechanized units, most notably with dive bombers, but also with light observation aircraft, such as Fieseler Storch, that rapidly corrected the aim of artillery and gave commanders a literal overview of the battle. Allied analysts noted that Poland lacked an effective air defense and was trying to protect too large an area, 90. France and the Low Countries, Dunkirk. German air-ground coordination was also evident in the 1940 German campaign in the Low Countries and France. The continental air defenses were not well organized, 91. The Germans deployed, among others, the trimotor Ju-52 transport for airborne troops in the attack on the Netherlands on 10 May 1940. The first large-scale air attack with paratroops in history subsequently occurred during the Battle for The Hague. No fewer than 295 Ju-52s were lost in that venture and in other parts of the country, due to varying circumstances, among which were accurate and effective Dutch anti-aircraft defenses and German mistakes in using soggy airfields not able to support the heavy aircraft. 92. Thus, almost an entire year's production was lost in the Netherlands. These losses were never surpassed in any air battle in history. The lack of sufficient numbers of aircraft most probably heavily influenced the decision not to invade England following the Battle of Britain. 92. In total, the Germans lost over 2,000 planes in the continuous air war over the Netherlands. 93. This high number can also be attributed to the main Allied air lanes into Germany that led directly over the Netherlands. Altogether, over 5,000 aircraft were lost over the Netherlands, Allied and German, and over 20,000 crew lost their lives in these mishaps. Most of these crew were buried locally, so that the Netherlands has some 600 places where Allied and Nazi airmen are buried. This makes the country the densest burial place for air crew in all of Europe. Losses over the Netherlands 1939, 1945 Allied, German. Fighters 1,273, 1,175. Bombers 2,164, 454. Seaplanes, Rex 88-85. Transports 132, 286 *. Total Incal, MISC, 3,667, 2017 total 5,684.94. Asterisk, 274 of these on May 10, 1940. While German aircraft inflicted heavy losses at the Battle of Dunkirk, and soldiers awaiting evacuation, while under attack, bitterly asked, where was the Royal Air Force? The RAF had been operating more effectively than other air defenses in the field, meeting the German attacks before they reached the battlefield. 95. Battle of Britain. Main articles: Battle of Britain, aircraft of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Air superiority or supremacy was a prerequisite to Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe's primary task was intended to be the destruction of the Royal Air Force (RAF). The warplanes on both sides were comparable. Germany had more planes, but they used much of their fuel getting to Britain, and so had more limited time for combat. 96. Hawker Hurricane, workhorse of the British defense in the Battle of Britain. A formation of Heinkel He 111 medium bombers, the most numerous German bomber of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe used 1,300 medium bombers guarded by 900 fighters. They made 1,500 sorties a day from bases in France, Belgium, and Norway. The Germans realized their Ju-87 Stukas and Heinkel He 111s were too vulnerable to modern British fighters. The RAF had 650 fighters, with more coming out of the factories every day. Three main fighter types were involved in the battle: the German Messerschmitt Bf 109E and the British Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane accounted for most of the British kills throughout the battle because it made up the majority of the RAF fighter force. However, its kill-loss ratio was inferior to that of its counterpart, the Spitfire. Of the three aircraft, the Hurricane was designed much earlier and was generally considered the least capable. Despite the high numbers of Hurricanes in the RAF at that time, the Spitfire became synonymous with the Battle of Britain and was somewhat of a symbol of resistance in the minds of the British public through the battle. The Bf 109E subtype short combat radius of 330 km, 205 Mi-97, due to limited fuel capacity as designed, prevented it from adequately escorting the Kampfgeschwader Wings medium bombers over England, limiting it to only some 10 minutes of air combat over the UK before it had turned back for a safe return to northern France. This serious deficiency was not corrected until after the major air battles over England, through September 1940, had concluded. The Royal Air Force also had at its disposal a complex and integrated network of reporting stations and operations, control rooms incorporating the new innovation of radar. Known as the Dowding System, after Hugh Dowding, the commander of RAF Fighter Command during the battle and the man who ordered its implementation. It was the first integrated air defense system in the world, and is often credited with giving the RAF the ability to effectively counter German raids without the need for regular patrols by fighter aircraft, increasing the efficiency with which the RAF fighter force could operate. As such, the Dowding system is also often credited with a significant role in the overall outcome of the battle, and comparisons with the air warfare that occurred over France in the spring and early summer of 1940, in which there was no such system, and in which the Allied air forces were comprehensively defeated, seem to support this. At first, the Germans focused on RAF airfields and radar stations. However, when the RAF bomber forces, quite separate from the fighter forces, attacked Berlin, Hitler swore revenge and diverted the Luftwaffe to attacks on London. Using limited resources to attack civilians instead of airfields and radar proved a major mistake, as the civilians being hit were far less critical than the airfields and radar stations that were now ignored. London was not a factory city, and British aircraft production was not impeded. Indeed, it went up. The last German daylight raid came on September 30. The Luftwaffe realized it was taking unacceptable losses and broke off the attack, Occasional blitz raids hit London and other cities from time. In all, some 43,000 civilians were killed. The Luftwaffe lost 1,411 planes shot down of a grand total of 2,069 which were written off. The British lost about the same number, but could repair 289 of them. The British additionally lost 497 aircraft of Bomber and RAF Coastal Command shot down during that same period and hundreds of planes destroyed on the ground, lost by accidents or also written off. The successful British defense resulted from a better system that provided more concentration, better utilization of radar, and better ground control. Invasion of the Soviet Union. Main articles: Aerial warfare during Operation Barbarossa and Soviet Air Forces Section, World War II. See also, Western Allied Campaign in Romania. Operation Barbarossa opened in June 1941, with striking initial German successes. 98. In the air, many of the Soviets' aircraft were inferior, while the disparity in pilot quality may have been even greater. The purges of military leadership during the Great Terror heavily impacted command and control in all services. A destroyed Soviet MiG-3, 1941. At the outbreak of the war, Soviet Air Forces had just been purged of most of its top officers and was unready. By 1945, Soviet annual aircraft production outstripped that of the German Reich. 157,000 aircraft were produced. 11. In the first few days of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed 2,000 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground, at a loss of only 35 aircraft. 99. The main weakness accounting for the heavy aircraft losses in 1941 was the lack of experienced generals, pilots, and ground support crews, the destruction of many aircraft on the runways due to command failure to disperse them, and the rapid advance of the Wehrmacht ground troops, forcing the Soviet pilots on the defensive during Operation Barbarossa, while being confronted with more modern German aircraft. 100-101. The Soviets relied heavily on Ilyushin Il-2 Sh Termovik ground assault aircraft, the single most produced military aircraft design of all time, with some 36,183 examples produced, and the Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter, the beginning of a family of fighters from Alexander S. Yakovlev's design bureau in its many variants during the war years, with just over 34,500 Yak-1, Yak-3, Yak-7, and Yak-9 aircraft produced in total, 101, each of which became the most produced aircraft series of all time in their respective classes, together accounting for about half the strength of the VVS for most of the Great Patriotic War. The Yak-1 was a modern 1940 design and had more room for development, unlike the relatively mature design of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, itself dating from 1935. The Yak-9 brought the VVS to parity with the Luftwaffe, eventually allowing it to gain the upper hand over the Luftwaffe until in 1944, when many Luftwaffe pilots were deliberately avoiding combat. Citation needed. Chief Marshal of Aviation Alexander Novikov led the VVS from 1942 to the end of the war, and was credited with introducing several new innovations and weapons systems. For the last year of the war, German military and civilians retreating towards Berlin were hounded by constant strafing and light bombing. In one strategic operation, the Yassy-Kishinev Strategic Offensive, the 5th and 17th Air Armies and the Black Sea Fleet naval aviation aircraft achieved a 3-1 superiority in aircraft over the Luftflotte 4 and the Royal Romanian Air Force, allowing almost complete freedom from air harassment for the ground troops of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts. 102. Irina Sebrova, a flight commander in the Women's 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, also known as the Night Witches, flew 1,008 sorties in the war, more than any other member of the regiment. As with many Allied countries in World War II, The Soviet Union received Western aircraft through Lend-Lease, mostly Bell P-39 Airacobras, Bell P-63 Kingcobras, Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawks, Douglas A-20 Havocs, Hawker Hurricanes, and North American B-25 Mitchells. Some of these aircraft arrived in the Soviet Union in time to participate in the Battle of Moscow, and in particular with the PVO, or Soviet Air Defense Forces. 103 Soviet flyers in P-39s scored the highest individual kill totals of any ever to fly a U.S. aircraft. 2 air regiments were equipped with Spitfire Mk. VBS in early 1943, but immediately experienced unrelenting losses due to friendly fire as the British aircraft looked too much like the German Bf-109, 104. The Soviet Union was then supplied with some 1,200 Spitfire Mk. IXs from 1943. Soviet pilots liked them, but they did not suit Soviet combat tactics and the rough conditions at the forward airfields close to the front lines. Spitfires Mk. IXs were therefore assigned to air defense units, using the high-altitude performance to intercept and pursue German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. By 1944, the Spitfire IX was the main fighter used in this role and would remain so until 1947. Lend-Lease aircraft from the US and UK accounted for nearly 12% of total Soviet air power, 105. The Luftwaffe operated from bases in Norway against the convoys to the Soviet Union. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, circling the convoys out of their anti-aircraft artillery range, guided in attack aircraft, submarines, and surface ships. Also. Operation Torch and Tunisia Campaign. The Anglo-American invasion of Vichy French-controlled Northwest Africa was under command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In November 1942, at a time when the Luftwaffe was still strong, air operations were split, one force under U.S. control and the other under British control. One of Eisenhower's corps commanders, General Lloyd Fredendall, used his planes as a combat air patrol that circled endlessly over his front lines, ready to defend against Luftwaffe attackers. Like most infantrymen, Fredendall assumed that all assets should be used to assist the ground forces. More concerned with defense than attack, Fredendall was soon replaced by George Patton, 107. Likewise, the Luftwaffe made the mistake of dividing up its air assets and failed to gain control of the air or to cut Allied supplies. The RAF in North Africa, under Air Marshal Arthur Deter, concentrated its air power and defeated the Luftwaffe. The RAF had an excellent training program, using bases in Canada, maintained very high aircrew morale, and inculcated a fighting spirit. Senior officers monitored battles by radar and directed planes by radio to where they were most needed. The RAF's success convinced Eisenhower that its system maximized the effectiveness of tactical air power. The point was that air power had to be consolidated at the highest level and had to operate almost autonomously. Brigade, division, and corps commanders lost control of air assets, except for a few unarmed little grasshoppers, observation aircraft that reported the fall of artillery shells so the gunners could correct their aim. With one airman in overall charge, air assets could be concentrated for maximum offensive capability, not frittered away in ineffective penny packets. Eisenhower, a tanker in 1918 who had theorized on the best way to concentrate armor, recognized the analogy. Split up among infantry in supporting roles, tanks were wasted. Concentrated in a powerful force, they could dictate the terms of battle. 108. The fundamental assumption of air power doctrine was that the air war was just as important as the ground war. Indeed, the main function of the sea and ground forces, insisted the air enthusiasts, was to seize forward air bases. Field Manual 120, issued in July 1943, became the airman's Bible for the rest of the war citation needed, and taught the doctrine of equality of air and land warfare. 109. The idea of combined arms operations, air, land, sea, strongly appealed to Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower invaded only after he was certain of air supremacy, and he made the establishment of forward air bases his first priority. MacArthur's leaps reflected the same doctrine. In each theater, the senior ground command post had an attached air command post. Requests from the front lines went all the way to the top, where the air commander decided whether to act, when and how. This slowed down response time. It might take 48 hours to arrange a strike, and involved rejecting numerous requests from the infantry for help or intervention at times. Citation needed. Operations against Allied convoys. German air reconnaissance against North Atlantic and Russian convoys increased, with CAM ships carrying a single fighter still the main defense. The Luftwaffe's first major attack on the convoys began on 25 April 1942, when the 34-ship convoy PQJ-6 was attacked. PQ-17 to Murmansk started with 36 ships. Only 2 made it through when the Admiralty, falsely thinking Germany was attacking with a battleship, ordered the convoy and its escort to scatter. There was no battleship, but the Luftwaffe and a pack of German submarines sank 1 cruiser. Citation needed. 1 destroyer, 2 patrol boats, 4,000 tons, and 22 merchant ships, 139,216 tons. Nevertheless, most convoys did get through, 110. 1943. In some areas, such as the most intense part of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans enjoyed fleeting success. Grueling operations wasted the Luftwaffe away on the Eastern Front after 1942. 111 dubious. Discuss. Soviet Il-2 ground attack planes attack an enemy column. Voronezh Front, 1 July 1943. In early 1943, the Allied strategic bombers were directed against U-boat pens, which were easy to reach, and which represented a major strategic threat to Allied logistics. However, the pens were very solidly built. It took 7,000 flying hours to destroy 1 sub there, about the same effort that it took to destroy 1/3 of Cologne. 112. Japan was also still recovering from Midway. It kept producing planes but made few innovations, and the quality of its new pilots deteriorated steadily. Gasoline shortages limited the training and usage of the air forces. British technical advances. Building on their lead in radar and their experience with the Battle of the Beams, RAF Bomber Command developed a variety of devices to enable precision strategic bombing. G and OBO were beam-riding blind bombing aids, while H2S was the first airborne ground-scanning radar system, enabling improved navigation to a target and bombing at night, and through cloud if necessary. These could be used in conjunction with Pathfinder bombers to guarantee accurate strikes on targets in all weathers. The British also developed the techniques of operational research and analysis, using mathematical techniques to examine military tactics and recommend best practice. These were used to optimize the impacts of night bombing raids, which were expanded to sizes in excess of 1,000 bombers attacking one objective. Defensive technologies were invented, such as rear-facing airborne radar to detect night fighters and the use of window-to-blind German radar, giving the RAF striking capability far in excess of that which the Luftwaffe had been able to achieve. The de Havilland Mosquito bomber was beginning to be delivered in late 1942, combining a useful bomb load with speed to evade German fighters. It was used to harass German air defenses as well as challenging strikes, such as that on a Gestapo headquarters or prisons, as in Operation Jericho. The RAF also developed the use of earthquake bombs to attack huge structures thought to be invulnerable to conventional bombing. Creating the largest bomb used in the war and a specialist squadron to deliver it, a number of critical German infrastructure assets were destroyed, such as the Merhin and Edersee dams. The use of developments such as these contributed greatly to the success of the air bombing strategy during the remainder of the war. Citation needed. Mediterranean theater. In the Mediterranean, the Luftwaffe tried to stop the invasions of Sicily and Italy with tactical bombing. They failed because the Allied air forces systematically destroyed most of their airfields. The Germans ferociously opposed the Allied landing at Anzio in February 1944, but the Luftwaffe was outnumbered 5-1 and so outclassed in equipment and skill that it inflicted little damage. Italian airspace belonged to the Allies, and the Luftwaffe's strategic capability was nil. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had against the Salerno beachhead, but was outgunned 10-1, and then lost the vital airfields at Foggia. Foggia became the major base of the 15th Air Force. Its 2,000 heavy bombers hit Germany from the south, while the 4,000 heavies of the 8th Air Force used bases in Britain, along with 1,300 RAF heavies. While bad weather in the north often canceled raids, sunny Italian skies allowed for more action. After that, the Luftwaffe had only one success in Italy, a raid on the American port at Bari in December 1943. Only 30 out of 100 bombers got through, but one hit an ammunition ship, which was secretly carrying a stock of mustard gas for retaliatory use should the Germans initiate the use of gas. Clouds of American mustard gas caused over 2,000 Allied and civilian casualties, 113. 1944–45. In early 1944, the Allies continued to bomb Germany, while carefully attacking targets in France that could interfere with the invasion, planned for June. Destroying the Luftwaffe, 1944. In late 1943, the AAF suddenly realized the need to revise its basic doctrine. Strategic bombing against a technologically sophisticated enemy like Germany was impossible without air supremacy. General Arnold replaced Ira Eaker with Karl Spaatz, and most critically, Maj. Gen. Jimmy Doolittle, who fully appreciated the new reality. They provided fighter escorts all the way into Germany and back, and cleverly used B-17s as bait for Luftwaffe planes, which the escorts then shot down. Doolittle's slogan was, "The first duty of 8th AF fighters is to destroy German fighters," one aspect of modern offensive counterair. Oka. In one big week in February 1944, American bombers protected by hundreds of fighters flew 3,800 sorties, dropping 10,000 tons of high explosives on the main German aircraft and ball-bearing factories. The U.S. suffered 2,600 casualties, with a loss of 137 bombers and 21 fighters. Ball-bearing production was unaffected, as Nazi munitions boss Albert Speer repaired the damage in a few weeks. He even managed to double aircraft production. Sensing the danger, Speer began dispersing production into numerous small, hidden factories, 114–115. Bf-110, built to shoot down heavy Allied bombers by day, but mostly achieved success as a repurposed night fighter with Liechtenstein radar fitted. An FW-190A arming up, with a BR-21 unguided rocket projectile. By 1944, the Allies had overwhelming advantages. The Luftwaffe would have to come out and attack or see its planes destroyed at the factory. Before getting at the bombers, ideally with the twin-engine Zersterer heavy fighters meant for such tasks, the Germans had to confront the more numerous American fighters. The heavily armed Messerschmitt Bf-110 could kill a bomber, particularly those armed with a quartet each of the BR-21 large-caliber air-to-air unguided rockets, but its slower speed made it easy prey for Thunderbolts and Mustangs. The big, slow twin-engine Junkers Ju-88C, used for bomber-destroyer duties in 1942-3, as the American heavy bomber offensive got underway in August 1942, was dangerous because it could stand further off and fire its autocannon armament into the Type B-17 formations, sometimes with the specialized Ju-88P heavy-caliber Bordkanone armed bomber-destroyers attacking, but they too were hunted down. The same fate also faced single-engine fighters carrying pairs of the BR-21 rockets each, and the later used, heavily auto-cannon-armed Sternbach bomber-destroyer models of the Focke-Wulf FW-190A8 that replaced the twin-engine destroyers. Germany's severe shortage of aviation fuel had sharply curtailed the training of new pilots, and most of the instructors had been themselves sent into battle. Rookie pilots were rushed into combat after only 160 flying hours in training compared to 400 hours for the AAF, 360 for the RAF, and 120 for the Japanese. The low-quality German pilots of this late stage in the war never had a chance against more numerous, better-trained Allied pilots, 116. The Germans began losing 1,000 planes a month on the Western Front, and another 400 on the Eastern Front. Realizing that the best way to defeat the Luftwaffe was not to stick close to the bombers, but to aggressively seek out the enemy, by March 1944 Doolittle had ordered the Mustangs to go hunting for Jerries, flush them out in the air and beat them up on the ground on the way home. 117. As Mustangs were now ordered to fly in massive fighter sweeps, well ahead of the American combat box heavy bomber formations, as a determined form of air supremacy effort, clearing the skies well ahead of the bombers of any presence of the Luftwaffe's Jagdflieger fighter pilots. By early 1944, with the Zerstörergeschwader flown heavy Bf-110G and Me-410A Hornets twin-engine fighters being decimated by the Mustangs whenever they appeared. Direct attack against the bombers was carried out instead by the Luftwaffe's so-named Gefechtsverband formations, with heavily armed FW-190, as being escorted by Bf-109GS, as high-altitude escorts for the autocannon-armed 190, as when flying against the USAAF's combat box formations. However, Doolittle's new air supremacy strategy fatally disabled virtually any and all of the Luftwaffe's defensive efforts throughout 1944. On one occasion, German air controllers identified a large force of approaching B-17s and sent all the Luftwaffe's 750 fighters to attack. The bogies were all Mustangs flying well ahead of the American bombers' combat boxes, which shot down 98 interceptors while losing 11. The actual B-17s were well behind the Mustangs and completed their mission without a loss. In February 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its frontline fighters and 18% of its pilots. The next month it lost 56% of its fighters and 22% of the pilots. April was just as bad, 43% and 20%, and May was worst of all, at 50% and 25%. German factories continued to produce many new planes, and inexperienced new pilots did report for duty, but their life expectancy was down to a few combat sorties. Increasingly, the Luftwaffe went into hiding. With losses down to 1% per mission, the bombers now got through, 118. By April 1944, Luftwaffe tactical air power had vanished, and Eisenhower decided he could go ahead with the invasion of Normandy. He guaranteed the invaders that, if you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours. 119. For the last year of the war, German military and civilians retreating towards Berlin were hounded by the presence of Soviet low-flying aircraft, strafing and bombing them, an activity in which even the ancient Polikarpov Po-2, a much-produced flight training Uchebny biplane of 1920s design, took part. However, this was but a small measure of the experience the Wehrmacht were receiving due to the sophistication and superiority of the Red Air Force. In one strategic operation alone, the Yassi-Kishinev Strategic Offensive, the 5th and 17th Air Armies and the Black Sea Fleet naval aviation aircraft achieved a 3.3 to 1 superiority in aircraft over Luftflotte 4 and the Royal Romanian Air Force, allowing almost complete freedom from air harassment for the ground troops of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts. 120. The greatest Soviet fighter ace of World War II was Ivan Nikitovich Kozhedub, who scored 62 victories from 6 July 1943 to 16 April 1945, 121, the top score for any Allied fighter pilot of World War II.